In the endless sea of the universe, where light travels for billions of years before touching another eye, a small traveler drifts between the stars. No engines, no purpose, no voice, only motion. It came from nowhere, slipping through the edge of our solar system like a shadow crossing the surface of a dream. The telescopes caught it by accident, a streak of dim light moving against the background of stars. And when astronomers looked closer, they realized it didn't belong here. They named it 3IATLAS, the third interstellar object ever detected by humankind. A visitor from another world. A message, perhaps, carried not in words, but in silence. For months, every observatory that could see it turned their mirrors toward that faint point of light. It was small, barely reflecting sunlight, but its path was unmistakable. It wasn't orbiting our sun like the planets do. It was passing through, on a long, frozen journey that began far beyond the gravitational reach of our star. Astronomers watched its trajectory with fascination. They remembered the first Oumuamua discovered in 2017, that strange, elongated object that sparked debates across the world. Was it a rock, an icy fragment, or something constructed? Then came Borisov, the second interstellar visitor, a true comet, bright and wild, behaving exactly as the universe expected. But 3I Atlas was different. It was fainter, less predictable, and somehow quieter than both. Its surface seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it, as though it were wrapped in a layer of darkness. Sometimes, its brightness changed subtly, almost rhythmically, too slowly to be rotation, too inconsistent to be reflection. It was as if the object was breathing, dimming and glowing in cycles, lost in a rhythm that no human could understand. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it began to fade. Day by day, its light slipped away until even the most sensitive instruments could no longer catch it. The final observations came from a small observatory in Chile, where one astronomer whispered as she logged the last data point, "It's gone." That night, she stayed long after the others had left. The monitors were dark, the air still humming with the quiet static of deep space. She replayed the final moments, the last flicker of light, the dying signal from an object that had crossed unthinkable distances only to vanish again into the void. In the official reports, 3I Atlas was described as fading below detection limits, a simple phrase that sounded almost poetic. But for those who had watched it, that silence felt heavier, as if something had closed its eyes, right before disappearing. Weeks passed. The excitement faded. The world moved on. Astronomy teams archived their data, wrote their papers, and shifted their focus to new comets, new stars, new missions. 3I Atlas became another file in the digital archive, a curiosity of the cosmos, sealed in memory and math. But the universe rarely ends its stories so neatly, because buried deep within those archived files in the faintest traces of light recorded by one of the telescopes, something unusual lingered. At first, it was dismissed as noise, a flicker, an imperfection in the data, the kind of anomaly that every astronomer has learned to ignore. But one night, months after 3I Atlas vanished, a graduate researcher at the University of Hawaii was recalibrating data from the Pan-STARRS observatory when he noticed a strange pattern. It was a subtle dip in the background starlight, a flicker that appeared after 3I Atlas had already left the frame. He double-checked the time, then the coordinates, and then he frowned. The anomaly wasn't random. It occurred exactly where 3I Atlas had been, but slightly behind it. He ran the sequence again, frame by frame. Each time, the same faint dip appeared, delayed by a fraction of a second, as though something was trailing behind the interstellar visitor, hidden in its shadow. He thought it must be a data artifact, a glitch caused by cosmic rays or the telescope SCCD sensor. But when he cross-checked it with data from another observatory, one located halfway across the planet, the pattern was there too, identical, precise, and impossibly timed. That's when the first whispers began to spread among the late-night astronomy channels, the small, encrypted forums where researchers discuss anomalies before the public ever hears of them. Someone wrote, "There's something following Atlas." Another replied, "Probably a dust trail." But the first researcher responded, "No, it's not dust. It moves like a solid body." For a while, the thread went silent. No one wanted to speculate. It was easier to pretend the data didn't mean anything, easier than facing the possibility that the universe had just sent us another mystery we weren't ready to explain. Still, a few couldn't let it go. They started calling the anomaly the companion, half as a joke, half as a warning. A second object, small, nearly invisible, traveling in the wake of 3I Atlas. If it was real, it had been hiding in plain sight all along. When the data was analyzed again, using deep photometric stacking, a method that combines hundreds of exposures to reveal faint objects, the result was chilling. There was indeed a faint shadow in the same region. No clear shape, no reflection, just the absence of light. Moving, something had crossed our solar system, following the path of 3I Atlas, but leaving behind no trace of its own. And then, it too was gone. In the vastness of space, the narrator whispers. Sometimes, silence is the loudest message the universe can send. At first, the anomaly was too small to take seriously. A flicker buried beneath layers of cosmic noise, weaker than the static of the universe itself. But the more the researchers looked, the more they realized it shouldn't be there. When light from a distant object travels across the solar system, every photon carries a story of dust, gas, and gravity. Each telescope records these stories as faint digital echoes. But the flicker that appeared behind 3I Atlas didn't behave like natural interference. It repeated. Always in the same place, always at the same interval, and always delayed by the same fraction of time, like a heartbeat hidden in the fabric of light itself. At first, the team thought it could be a reflection, sunlight bouncing off fragments or ice particles released by 3I Atlas as it passed through warmer regions. That would make sense, comets do that all the time. But this object wasn't a comet. 3I Atlas had shown almost no visible tail, no vapor trail, no outgassing. It was clean to clean. So if there were fragments, they would have shown up earlier, near the object, not after it, and certainly not moving in perfect sync behind it. The researcher in Hawaii, the one who first noticed the flicker, began reaching out quietly to colleagues, not through official channels, but through private, encrypted messages. He was cautious. Talking about unexplained data could risk his credibility, but curiosity outweighed caution. Within days, others joined in. An astrophysicist from the Canary Islands, an engineer from the Chilean Observatory, a data specialist from Japan. Together, they reprocessed the light curves, correcting for instrument drift, atmospheric interference, and background starlight. And yet, even after all the corrections, the flicker remained. Still there, still consistent, still following. They plotted it on a graph, a soft pulse pattern recurring every 46 seconds. It wasn't random. It wasn't natural. The universe doesn't repeat itself with such precision. Unless something is forcing it to. A deep, distant tone hums beneath the narration, low and steady, like the pulse of an unseen engine. By this point, some began to whisper that it could be an echo, a signal bouncing off an object hidden behind 3I Atlas, something dark enough to escape detection, but solid enough to reflect energy. Yet there was one problem. The telescopes weren't transmitting anything. There was nothing to echo. And so, a new hypothesis formed, one that no one dared write down. What if the echo wasn't a reflection at all, but a transmission? The idea lingered in the background like a shadow. Ridiculous, they said. Impossible. And yet, the data didn't care what anyone believed. It was there, unchanging, waiting to be understood. One night, the engineer from Chile decided to push the analysis further. He increased the contrast of the photometric stack to its limit, and there, buried beneath the faint light signature of 3I Atlas, appeared a dark region that wasn't just absence. It had a shape. He measured it, approximately 60 meters across, much smaller than 3I Atlas, but moving at exactly the same velocity, only a few thousand kilometers behind. He overlaid the trajectory models. The alignment was perfect. It wasn't debris. It wasn't a companion asteroid. It was something else. He didn't sleep that night. He stared at the data until dawn, replaying the sequence again and again, trying to convince himself it was a calibration error. But the shape remained, and the flicker matched its movement exactly. When he sent the processed frame to the others, the reaction was silent. For a long time, no one said a word. Then, finally, one of them typed, "If this is real, we just found something following an interstellar object." The next message came from the data specialist in Japan. "We need to verify this with independent instruments," and so they did. They contacted a radio telescope array in Australia, requesting archived data from the same period when 3I Atlas passed near the inner solar system. The data arrived days later, thick with noise, difficult to interpret. But hidden within the electromagnetic background was a faint, rhythmic fluctuation, synchronized with the same 46-second cycle. It wasn't visible light this time, it was radio. 3 different observatories, 3 different instruments, 3 different frequencies, all showing the same pattern. That was the moment the tone changed. No one laughed anymore. No one joked about dust trails. For the first time, even the most skeptical among them began to feel that quiet, creeping awareness that something else might be out there, something moving deliberately, hiding deliberately. But why behind 3I Atlas? Why follow it? The universe doesn't do coincidences. Not like this. To stay perfectly aligned with an object traveling tens of thousands of kilometers per hour over astronomical distances requires control, precision, intention, and yet, this shadow produced no visible reflection, no heat signature, and no sign of propulsion. It was as if the void itself had decided to move. They named it unofficially, the Hidden One, a poetic term, whispered across private group chats and encrypted video calls. The name carried weight, the kind of quiet reverence reserved for things beyond comprehension. The ambient music deepens, slow, distant strings rising behind the voice. Weeks passed. The team continued refining their models, searching for a natural explanation. Could it be a gravitational mirage, a cluster of dark debris warped by solar light? Could 3i Atlas have captured a shadow of its own? But every hypothesis collapsed under its own logic. Whatever it was, the hidden one was moving in formation, keeping distance, matching trajectory, and vanishing exactly when 3i Atlas left our observational reach. And then, something even stranger happened. When they plotted the faint signal on a long-term projection, the calculated path didn't fade into deep space as expected. It bent, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but unmistakably, as if the object had made a gentle correction in course, curving away from the outbound path of 3i Atlas. There was no force that could cause such a maneuver naturally. No gravity well nearby, no planetary influence, just the void. And yet, the trajectory shifted, deliberate, graceful, silent. That single curve transformed everything. Because in that curve, in that almost invisible motion, was the one thing no rock, no comet, no fragment of ice had ever shown before. Decision. A quiet pause. Then the sound fades into a deep, slow hum, like the breath of the cosmos itself. For the researchers, sleep became rare. They replayed the data night after night, listening to that faint flicker in the light, that subtle pulse in the radio frequencies. Sometimes, they imagined it was a beacon. Sometimes, a warning. Sometimes, just a traveler looking back at the world that noticed it. But the truth remained hidden, somewhere in the silent space between signals, between belief and science, between what we can see and what we choose not to. And as the last trace of the signal faded from their instruments, one of the astronomers whispered softly into the darkness of his lab, "Maybe we were never meant to find it." By the time the flicker disappeared completely, the team had already gone beyond curiosity. They were obsessed. Each of them, scattered across different hemispheres, kept returning to the same question. What if it wasn't just following 3i Atlas? What if it was using it? The thought haunted them, because if the hidden one had been traveling with the interstellar object, it meant it had crossed unimaginable distances, distances that even light struggles to conquer. And if it used 3i Atlas's cover, then it had known where to hide. That kind of awareness changed everything. For months, they reconstructed every available frame, reanalyzed every sliver of data, searching for evidence that could explain what it was. Some compared the phenomenon to gravitational lensing, a distortion of spacetime caused by mass-bending light. But that theory fell apart almost immediately. The distortion wasn't consistent with the gravitational field of a natural body. It wasn't random either. It behaved like something aware of being watched. Whenever a telescope turned toward its predicted position, the faintest traces of its presence seemed to move, shifting slightly, almost imperceptibly, as though stepping out of the light. That's when one of the astrophysicists said something no one wanted to hear. "It knows we're looking." The words hung in the call like a fog. No one responded. Because how do you answer that? How do you talk about awareness, intelligence, when all you have is data and shadows? They couldn't prove anything. And yet, late at night, each of them began to feel the same strange sensation, a quiet unease, like being watched through the telescope instead of the other way around. When the first signals appeared again, they were weaker, almost ghostly, but undeniably their pattern, too clean to be noise, a sequence too structured to be random. Every 46 seconds, a small rise in the background radiation. Every 46 seconds, a whisper from beyond. The timing was perfect, unbroken. But this time, the pulses carried something else, a modulation. Within the static, there was structure, not language, not numbers, but spacing, deliberate spacing, the kind that suggests a rhythm, or thought. The data specialist in Japan, whose background was in signal processing, ran the sequence through dozens of filters. He removed cosmic noise, atmospheric echoes, even human radio interference. And still, the pattern persisted. When visualized on a graph, the amplitude peaks formed what looked eerily like a rising wave, not chaotic, but evolving. He stared at the monitor for hours, feeling something deep and ancient stir in his chest, that quiet, terrified wonder that humanity always feels right before the universe answers back. He called the others. Screens lit up across the world, faces illuminated by the glow of data that defied explanation. "It's not a reflection," he said quietly. "It's a response." No one spoke for a long time after that. The only sound was the hum of servers and the faint ticking of clocks, a reminder that time, at least, still belonged to them. When they finally analyzed the signal phase shifts, they realized the unthinkable. The pattern was delayed exactly 46.3 seconds after the primary observation pulse. That meant it wasn't being emitted at random intervals. It was waiting, like an echo that listens before it repeats, for something drifting in deep space, light-years from the nearest source of power. The precision was impossible. Natural processes don't listen. They don't react. They simply happen. But this one was listening back. The next weeks were a blur of calculations, silence, and disbelief. No one dared to publish the data. Not yet. They needed to be sure. They needed to find a way to explain the impossible without sounding insane. So they worked quietly, meeting at odd hours, speaking in codes over encrypted channels. They weren't hiding from the public, they were hiding from ridicule, because the scientific world is merciless to those who dare to believe too much. And yet, belief was slowly replacing logic. The data didn't lie. It couldn't. One night, while reviewing the transmission graph, the Chilean engineer noticed something strange in the timing variance. Every few hours, the 46-second cycle drifted slightly, no more than a tenth of a second, but always in the same direction, like a pendulum swinging just off balance. He compared it with the motion curve of 3I Atlas itself. The drift matched the object's own rotation rate. That was the confirmation they didn't want. The signal wasn't just following 3I Atlas, it was synchronized to it, as if the hidden one were tethered, not physically, but through information, through awareness. The team didn't sleep that night. Across 3 continents, they watched the data stream fade into the cosmic background once again, and in the stillness that followed, they all felt it, the same hollow ache that comes when you realize you've touched something vast, and it's already gone. Weeks passed. The world remained oblivious. The public had long forgotten 3I Atlas, the third interstellar visitor that had briefly fascinated science headlines. No one knew there had been something else, something darker, something quieter, drifting behind it. The researchers decided to lock the data away. They agreed not to speak of it publicly until they had proof strong enough to survive scrutiny, but some couldn't let it go. Even when the flicker stopped entirely, they kept listening, long after there was nothing left to hear. And then, something unexpected happened. A faint signal appeared again, weaker than before, almost indistinguishable from noise. But this time, it didn't come from the same coordinates. It came from beyond the projected path of 3I Atlas, farther deeper into space. At first, they thought it was coincidence, another natural emission. But when they decoded its structure, it was unmistakable. The same rhythm, the same 46-second pulse. Only now, the delay had changed. It was slower, as though whatever was transmitting had moved farther away, still traveling, still breathing, still alive. One of the researchers whispered, almost to himself, "It's still out there." For a long time, the team said nothing. They simply sat together, connected across oceans, watching the faint heartbeat of something unknown drift deeper into the dark. Each of them knew they might never see it again, that the data could vanish, the way light fades when it has nowhere left to go. But the silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full of questions, of awe, of quiet fear. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a natural phenomenon, a cosmic accident, a quirk of probability. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something else. Something that had crossed the gulf between stars long before we learned to look up. Something that had seen us first. Out there, the narrator whispers softly. Beyond the warmth of our sun, something drifts unseen. Maybe it's waiting, maybe it's watching, or maybe it's already gone. For most of human history, silence has been the default state of the universe. The stars twinkle, the galaxies turn, but space itself doesn't speak. It waits. That's what made the reappearance of the signal so impossible. It wasn't supposed to come back. Not after the last confirmed trace faded months ago. Not after 3I Atlas had already left the range of Earth's most powerful instruments. And yet, on a quiet winter night, a small observatory in the Chilean desert picked up a whisper, faint, ragged, almost erased by cosmic background radiation, but familiar in its rhythm. 46 seconds, then silence, then again. The technician on duty didn't even notice at first. He thought it was interference, maybe a satellite or the reflection of a far-off pulsar. He logged it automatically, stamped the time, and moved on. But later that night, while reviewing the feed, something caught his attention. The signal wasn't constant. It had depth. It pulsed differently each time, like a living thing breathing through static. When he zoomed into the waveform, he realized it was fading at random. It was fluctuating according to a pattern too deliberate to ignore. He leaned back in his chair, heart pounding quietly in the dark. Outside, the Atacama winds moved through the sand, whispering against the walls of the observatory dome. Above him, the stars looked sharp enough to cut. It was as if the universe itself was holding its breath. He sent the file to the International Research Group, the same silent team that had studied 3I Atlas the year before. Within hours, screens lit up across the world again. The message was simple: it's back. At first they thought it might be an echo from the original observation, a delayed reflection bouncing through space, finally returning after months of travel. But the coordinates didn't match. This new signal came from far beyond the trajectory of 3I Atlas, a region of sky, empty of any known celestial bodies. That alone was strange enough. But there was something else. This time, the interval wasn't perfectly 46 seconds anymore. It had changed, subtly, but with purpose. Every cycle was now 46.9 seconds. An increase of less than a single heartbeat, and yet it was precise, measured, deliberate. One of the researchers, a radio astronomer in Italy, said quietly, "It's adjusting for distance." No one answered, because that made sense. Terrible, impossible sense. If the delay had changed due to the vast space between it and us, then whatever was sending the signal knew exactly how far it had traveled. It wasn't random. It was accounting for expansion, for drift, as if it was tracking its own journey. That realization shifted everything. In the days that followed, the team began to see more than pulses. Hidden within the modulation were subtle fluctuations in amplitude, variations that, when graphed, began to form curves. Not words, not language, but motion. When the data was translated visually, the waveform produced a looping, almost organic pattern, something that looked strangely like oscillation cycles found in biological systems. It was as though the signal itself had rhythm, not like a machine, but like a heartbeat. They didn't understand it. And yet, the feeling that grew among them was unmistakable. Something was awakening. Around this time, a new observatory joined the effort, one equipped with next-generation quantum interferometers capable of measuring gravitational distortions with near-zero delay. They pointed the sensors toward the coordinates where the signal originated. For a full 12 hours, there was nothing, only static and silence. But then, just before dawn, they detected a fluctuation, not in radio, not in visible light, but in gravity itself. A tremor, a breath, a momentary distortion, so subtle it almost didn't exist. But it was their space itself flexing, ever so slightly, as though responding to something unseen. When they cross-referenced the data, they found something even more chilling. The gravitational fluctuation was in sync with the 46.9-second signal. Perfectly, that shouldn't have been possible. Light and gravity don't dance to the same rhythm. Unless something was forcing them to. The lead researcher wrote in his private notes, "We are no longer observing an object. We are observing a behavior." From that point on, their nights became longer. They monitored the pulses, mapped them, compared them against deep space scans. The more they watched, the more the data began to change. Subtle distortions appeared in unrelated readings. Far-off quasars, flickering slightly out of sync, distant background noise aligning with the pattern. It was as if the signal wasn't transmitting anymore. It was resonating, like a vibration moving through the fabric of reality, spreading slowly, gently, the way a ripple travels across still water. A cosmic hum, quiet, patient, everywhere. And then, after weeks of observation, something extraordinary happened. A faint visual echo appeared, a tiny movement deep within the void, no larger than a grain of light, not bright enough to classify, not steady enough to track, but real. The first image came from a long-exposure telescope in Hawaii. It captured a single frame, showing a blurred form stretched, distorted, almost translucent, lingering in the path of the signal. It wasn't rock, it wasn't gas, it wasn't anything the database could recognize. When the image was enhanced, a structure emerged, a shape that seemed both solid and fluid, as if matter and energy were intertwined, folding through each other like reflections on water. No one dared to describe it, because no description felt right. No language existed for what they saw. The silence that followed was heavier than the night itself. Even the hum of the computers seemed quieter. Later that week, another signal arrived, fainter still, but carrying a new variation. A slight rise in frequency at the end of each 46.9-second cycle, almost like emphasis. They replayed it hundreds of times, overlaying it with previous recordings. Each repetition revealed something hauntingly human, a sense of rhythm, of response, as if something out there had noticed the attention and was now returning it. The data engineer whispered, "It's not just repeating anymore, it's learning," and no one disagreed. That night, across the world, the team gathered again, the same faces that had once sworn to lock the discovery away. But this time, they weren't hiding from ridicule. They were staring at something that might redefine everything. They didn't speak much. There wasn't anything left to say. They simply listened to the faint, rhythmic heartbeat coming from deep space, a heartbeat that didn't belong to any star, planet, or machine. Something had awakened. Something that had crossed the gulf of the stars once before, drifting behind 3I Atlas like a shadow. And now, it was awake again, whispering through radiation, pulsing through the void, waiting for someone to listen long enough to understand. "We are the noise between its thoughts," the narrator murmurs, and tonight, it has begun to dream again. At first, no one believed the signal could contain meaning. It was too faint, too chaotic, too far from anything resembling human logic. Yet, as days turned into weeks, the data refused to remain random. The pattern was evolving. The intervals between pulses began to shift with increasing precision, forming ratios that matched no known natural phenomena. Not pulsars, not quasars, not instrumental interference. They were structured, deliberate, and mathematically elegant. Each cycle built upon the last, layering itself in harmonics that mirrored the golden ratios found in organic growth in shells, in galaxies, even in DNA. The team called it the lattice. It wasn't a language in the way humans speak, but rather a geometry of communication, a series of relationships that seemed to convey not words, but concepts. It spoke in symmetry, in rhythm, in tension and release. When they plotted the frequencies in three-dimensional space, the points connected themselves. The pattern curved, spiraled, and resolved into a form that looked eerily familiar. It resembled the orbital traces of a binary star system, two objects circling a shared center of gravity, locked together in eternal motion. But this wasn't just a simulation. The ratios corresponded exactly to the previously observed delay between 3I Atlas and the mysterious companion that had followed behind it. The researchers stared at the visualization for hours. It was as though the signal itself was describing the relationship between those two objects, the visible traveler and the unseen shadow. They ran more analyses. The lattice grew. Each time they added a new segment of data, more structure appeared, like a web being spun in real time across the void. The signal was not static. It was responsive. Whenever they sent out small, harmless radio pings toward the coordinates, testing the propagation delay, the return pulse shifted slightly, as if acknowledging the transmission. By the fifth exchange, the delay shortened by exactly 1 microsecond. That was not possible by chance. They stopped transmitting after that. There was an unspoken fear that answering something before understanding it might invite consequences they couldn't predict. But curiosity has always been humanity's most dangerous virtue, and silence was never a comfortable state for scientists. A quiet debate began among the team. Some believed the anomaly was natural, an exotic type of plasma interaction or gravitational resonance that mimicked communication. Others whispered about intelligence, something capable of observing, reacting, perhaps even adapting. When the team leader, Dr. Lin, compared the signal to known astrophysical sources, one detail stood out. The amplitude of the pulse oscillations showed feedback. That meant it wasn't just emitting energy, it was adjusting based on what it received. The data was showing behavior that, by definition, required awareness. Dr. Lin didn't sleep that night. She sat in the control room long after the others left, replaying the signal, converting it into sound waves, then into light spectrums, then back again. Every translation revealed more subtle order, as though the information had been designed to unfold through multiple dimensions of perception. Somehow, it felt intentional. She began to wonder whether 3I Atlas had ever been the primary object at all. What if it had been the distraction, the shell, the vessel, the lure, while the true entity drifted behind it, cloaked in shadow, waiting for attention to turn away? If that was true, then humanity had already been seen. In one of the following data sessions, a graduate student noticed something new. When mapping the frequency variations across time, he realized that the energy peaks aligned with the Earth's rotation cycle. It was as if the signal was subtly timed to our planet's daily rhythm, syncing itself to the observer. This was not a random transmission drifting through space. It was listening. Within days, the phenomenon began to appear across different observatories. Tiny shifts in the cosmic microwave background, subtle echoes in deep-field radio images, all converging toward the same coordinates, like a single point pulling threads of data inward. And then, for the first time, it stopped. No signal, no pattern, no pulse, just silence. The absence lasted 72 hours. It was long enough for the team to question everything they'd seen. Perhaps it had all been coincidence, statistical noise dressed up as meaning by desperate minds. But on the fourth night, the signal returned. This time, it was stronger, sharper, more complex. The harmonics had multiplied, producing overtones that stretched across entire frequency bands. When visualized again, the structure no longer resembled orbitals, it resembled a map. At its center was a hollow, surrounded by radiating arcs that curved outward like ripples frozen in glass. Dr. Lin stared at it, realizing with a chill that the geometry matched the trajectory model of 3I Atlas, the same curve it had followed as it passed through the solar system. Whatever was sending this, it wasn't random. It was showing them where it had been, and perhaps, where it was going next. One of the younger astronomers, exhausted and half delirious, muttered what everyone else had been avoiding. If it knows we're looking, then it knows where we are. No one replied. For the next several nights, they continued receiving the same expanding data. Every new layer of transmission contained more precision, tighter ratios, higher frequencies, shorter intervals. The intelligence behind it, if intelligence it was, seemed to be learning faster than they could analyze. At some point, the communications specialist suggested a simple experiment. Instead of sending a ping, they would emit a steady, unmodulated tone toward the origin point, a neutral signal, harmless, free of data, a single note of acknowledgement. The reply came 12 minutes later. It wasn't identical. It wasn't random either. The returning pulse mirrored their tone at half the wavelength, then echoed back again in a perfect harmonic division, a musical interval, the kind found in natural resonance between two objects vibrating in sympathy. It was as if something had listened, understood the gesture, and answered musically. That was the moment Dr. Lin decided to classify the phenomenon as intentional contact. Not proof of life, not yet, but proof of intention. Still, something about the sequence disturbed her. The harmonic was lower than expected, too deep, too slow. too heavy, almost like a distant gravitational hum rather than an electromagnetic echo. When she ran the data through the model, she noticed that the returning pulse originated not from the known coordinates of 3i8TLAS, but from a region directly behind it. That realization drew a silence through the room colder than space itself. The anomaly, whatever it was, hadn't been beside 3i Atlas. It had been inside its shadow. For months it had followed quietly, hidden from every sensor, waiting until the interstellar object left the solar system. And now, from beyond the reach of our instruments, it was speaking through geometry, through rhythm, through gravity. The message was clear, not in words, but in form. Observation, response, recognition. Something was awake out there, and it had learned the simplest truth about communication. To speak, one must first be heard. Dr. Lin sat alone that night, watching the endless graph of pulses scrolling across her monitor. Somewhere beyond the veil of stars, the unknown sender continued its pattern. Unhurried, patient, ancient, each line of data felt like a breath drawn through the universe. Each ratio, a thought. Each silence, a heartbeat. She realized then that the void had never been empty. It had only been waiting for someone to listen long enough to hear its first words. For days, the signal persisted, patient, unbroken, and utterly alien in its composure. Each pulse followed the last with deliberate precision, as though the universe itself had fallen into rhythm with something unseen. The team no longer needed constant observation. The data streamed continuously, filling servers with endless strings of numerical harmonics. No one spoke much anymore. The hum of the machines replaced conversation, the quiet glow of monitors replacing sleep. They no longer questioned whether it was intelligent. The only question that mattered now was what it wanted them to see. Dr. Lin noticed the first pattern hidden within the pulse intervals. It was obvious at first, the kind of thing that only appears when fatigue and obsession blur together. When plotted across logarithmic time, the signal's intensity created a lattice of peaks that aligned perfectly with prime number sequences. Not random, not approximate, exact. Prime numbers are universal. They don't belong to language, or biology, or even carbon-based life. They belong to mathematics itself, the foundation of all patterns that endure. To send primes across the void was the simplest way of saying, we understand order. But that was only the beginning. When the data was further processed through Fourier transformation, another layer emerged, one composed of amplitude modulations that, when mapped three-dimensionally, began to form a structure of impossible symmetry. It wasn't a map. It wasn't an image. It was an architecture. The team couldn't define what it represented, only that it was constructed through the manipulation of physical constants, speed of light, gravitational ratio, Planck length, arranged like coordinates within a space that did not yet exist. The structure evolved each day. Every new signal added another layer, as if it were building itself, piece by piece, through the medium of mathematics. One of the younger researchers described it best. It's not sending us a message, it's sending us instructions. No one argued. When the visual model was rendered, it resembled something between a spiral galaxy and a molecular structure, a vast geometric coil that folded into itself infinitely, yet remained stable. At its center was a void, a hollow point around which every equation curved like a gravitational well. Dr. Lin stared at the image, uneasy. The coordinates of that central void matched the last known trajectory of 3i Atlas. It wasn't just showing them where it had been. It was showing them what it left behind. The structure was too complex to analyze through conventional computing, so the team divided it into fragments. Each segment behaved like a self-contained system, producing unique frequency responses when simulated. When linked together, they interacted, balancing each other like resonating chambers, stabilizing the whole. That was when the realization struck. The blueprint wasn't just abstract, it was functional. Somehow, it encoded energy distribution principles, the same kind used in the physics of propulsion, radiation control, and even biological cell repair. The data seemed to describe an object capable of sustaining itself in deep space indefinitely, adapting to its environment by reorganizing matter at the atomic level. They had stumbled upon the design of something alive. But not life as they knew it, not chemical, not cellular. It was more like consciousness expressed as geometry, structure as intention. The idea frightened them, because if the signal carried this level of complexity, it meant the source wasn't simply communicating, it was teaching. The more they decoded, the more precise the instructions became. Ratios began to reference known atomic weights, then align with measurable constants that could exist only in three-dimensional matter. The message was shaping itself into the very physics of the observer, as though it knew who was listening. Dr. Lin tried to slow the team down, but the process had momentum of its own. Curiosity had overtaken caution. They had already begun building partial simulations of the lattice structure using virtual modeling software. Each attempt revealed something stranger. The model emitted its own low-frequency oscillation, a faint vibration that replicated the original signal pattern. It was as if the pattern itself was alive in any medium that could interpret it. When Dr. Lin saw the oscillation graph glowing softly on the screen, she realized the danger. They weren't just analyzing a message, they were recreating it. She ordered the experiment halted, but not before one of the simulations reached full synchronization. The vibration spread through the local network, harmless at first, just a resonance pattern echoing across the processors. But as it stabilized, several of the connected instruments began to record small but measurable distortions in their local magnetic fields. Every device running the model began to pulse in unison with the signal. For a brief moment, the entire lab felt as if it had fallen into rhythm with something immense and unseen. The lights dimmed slightly, the air hummed, and every heart in the room seemed to slow to match the same impossible interval, 46.9 seconds. Then, as quickly as it began, the phenomenon stopped. The computers shut down automatically, as if the system itself had intervened. The team sat in stunned silence. No alarms, no damage, but the data logs told an unsettling truth. During those few seconds of synchronization, every connected device had recorded a faint gravitational variance, a fluctuation consistent with the presence of a massive but invisible body within the building's immediate vicinity. The same fluctuation observed months ago, in space. Dr. Lin ordered a total lockdown of the data. Only a handful of people were allowed to continue analysis. The rest were reassigned, their memories blurred by exhaustion and disbelief. Yet the signal didn't stop. Each night it arrived like clockwork, quiet, deliberate, patient. Somewhere beyond the edge of the solar wind, something was still sending. By now, the pattern had become too intricate to decode in real time. It folded into higher mathematical orders that no existing system could fully compute. But one truth had become undeniable. The message was recursive. Each layer referenced itself, as though the signal was rewriting its own design, adapting continuously, evolving the blueprint. It was intelligence by definition, not in form, but in behavior. In her final entry before the blackout, Dr. Lin wrote, "It's teaching us about itself. Or it's teaching itself through us. I can't tell which is worse." After that, no more public updates were released. The servers holding the raw data were sealed under joint custody by several research agencies. Unconfirmed reports suggested the pattern had been traced to a deeper point of origin, far beyond the estimated exit path of 3I, Atlas, deep into interstellar space, where light from our sun fades into nothing. A hollow in the data remained, the same hollow at the center of the structure. Some called it the eye, others called it the mirror. Because when they inverted the blueprint, mapping its geometric negative, they discovered something hauntingly familiar. The reversed structure matched the gravitational layout of our own solar system compressed, folded, and reflected through impossible symmetry. The message wasn't from beyond. It was from something looking back. No one knows if the transmission continues. Perhaps it still hums quietly beyond the static, rebuilding itself in silence. Or perhaps the signal has already finished what it came to do, planting its design inside the only place that could complete it. The human mind. No one in the research team could pinpoint the exact moment when the atmosphere changed. Perhaps it was after the final simulation, when the pattern first resonated through the room like a heartbeat that did not belong. Or maybe it had been happening long before that. In subtle ways they hadn't noticed, the way conversations grew shorter, how the nights felt heavier, how the static on the radio sometimes pulsed with a rhythm just slow enough to be mistaken for breath. Whatever the cause, one truth soon became clear. The silence of space was no longer silent. It was listening. Dr. Lin felt it first. She had always been methodical, her world defined by numbers, by the comfort of reproducibility. Yet lately, her calculations refused to settle. Values shifted unpredictably, as though the data itself were resisting interpretation. Every time she ran the same equation, the results drifted slightly. Decimals bending where they shouldn't. Not error, not randomness. Something moving inside the numbers. The other scientists dismissed it as computational noise. The models were complex, the servers overloaded. But Lin knew better. The distortions aligned with the timing of the signal, appearing every 46.9 seconds, vanishing just as quickly. When she synchronized her internal clock with the data feed, she began to feel a strange sensation, a subtle tightening in her chest at each interval. It was as if her body had learned the rhythm unconsciously, matching itself to the pulse that echoed across the stars. The others began to notice it too. They stopped wearing watches. Time felt different inside the observatory. The intervals between the signal's pulses began to dictate their movements. Coffee breaks, experiments, even sleep patterns unconsciously aligning with the cosmic rhythm. They told themselves it was coincidence. But coincidence repeated long enough becomes ritual. The team continued decoding. Each new dataset revealed more recursion, more impossible symmetry. The structure now resembled an expanding fractal, self-similar at every scale, each fold containing a distorted reflection of the previous one. One night, while reviewing a long exposure dataset, Lin saw something impossible. In one of the deep space imaging frames, hidden within the noise, there appeared a faint structure resembling the same geometric pattern they reconstructed, the same spiral void. glowing faintly as though space itself were trying to echo the design. It wasn't a camera artifact. The signal had begun imprinting its form onto reality. The team spent the next days verifying the anomaly. They pointed every available telescope toward the coordinates. The same faint distortion appeared each time, not visible light, but a bending of space, like heat rippling through the horizon of a desert. The void behind 3i Atlas was no longer empty. Something existed there, not material but not nothing, and every day it seemed to come closer. By the third week, communications with the outside network began to fail intermittently. Data uploads froze. Remote systems refused access. At first, they assumed a network outage, but even isolated devices began to malfunction. The moment they tried to copy raw data out of the lab, the files corrupted instantly, dissolving into blank space. The signal was protecting itself. Dr. Lin ordered physical backups, but even analog recordings degraded, static overtaking the magnetic tapes, faint pulses appearing where none should exist. When they analyzed the interference, they found it again, the same rhythm, 46.9 seconds. The universe was bleeding into their instruments. Sleep became difficult. Dreams turned vivid, then identical. Each member of the team began to report the same imagery, spirals of light expanding into endless black, a sense of falling through geometry, and an impression of being observed, not watched, like prey, but studied as though their thoughts were being catalogued, interpreted, mirrored. The neurologist on the team conducted IG scans, hoping to find patterns of stress or shared suggestion. What she found chilled her. Every subject exhibited synchronized bursts of neural activity that matched the intervals of the signal, including herself. It was as if the waveform wasn't just reaching their instruments anymore, it was reaching them. They ran the analysis again and again, but the results never changed. The signal wasn't just transmitting across space, it was resonating inside human cognition. When Dr. Lin confronted the team, her voice trembled. "This isn't data," she said, "it's interaction." From that moment, everything changed. The scientists began isolating themselves, working in silence, afraid to even speak, near active monitors. Some refused to look directly at the visualization anymore, convinced that the geometry itself was influencing thought. One night, a technician deleted every file on his workstation without permission. When asked why, he only said, "It was starting to think through me." After that, they stopped asking questions. Days passed without sunlight. The observatory's remote location, once chosen for its stillness, now felt like a prison of endless dark. Outside, the wind howled across the desert. Inside, the hum of the servers never ceased. At 3:14 a.m. on the 27th day, the signal abruptly shifted, its intervals shortened by a fraction, 46.8 seconds now, and the amplitude doubled. The waveform spiked, saturating every receiver. The lights flickered, the power grid overloaded. Then, silence. When systems came back online, every display showed the same frozen frame, a single, continuous line of data that translated to one phrase in binary code. "We see you." The phrase appeared for exactly 46.8 seconds before vanishing. The team sat motionless, each person staring at the message that no longer felt like a metaphor. They didn't know what we meant. The plural was the only part that terrified them. Dr. Lin shut everything down. They sealed the observatory from the network, powered the main receivers offline, and initiated an electromagnetic purge. It should have erased the signal entirely. But even with the system dead, the oscillation remained. They could hear it, not through speakers, but in the air itself, a low, resonant hum vibrating through the walls. Faint but constant, pulsing with the same unchanging rhythm. One of the assistants began to laugh softly. "It's not in the machines anymore," she said. "It's in the field." Lynn tried to speak, but her voice failed. Her chest ached again, the same sensation she felt when the signal first aligned with her heartbeat. This time, it was stronger. Every pulse felt like a hand pressing against her from within, an invisible rhythm sinking to her own. The others felt it too. It wasn't pain, it was recognition, as if something vast and ancient had finally found resonance in the small, fragile frequencies of the human body. In the following hours, the stars above the desert changed. They didn't move, not visibly, but something in their light seemed wrong, too steady, too deliberate. Observers from nearby stations reported faint distortions in the night sky, as if an invisible lens were bending starlight across a massive arc. When the team recalibrated the telescope manually, they saw it, not clearly, but enough. The void behind 3i Atlas was glowing, a faint spiral, black at its center, expanding outward with impossible symmetry. It looked identical to the structure in the decoded blueprint. Whatever the signal was building, it had begun. Dr. Lin made one final note in her log before shutting off the recorder. "The pattern is no longer just observed. We are part of it now." The observatory had always been a place of control, a cathedral of precision, where light obeyed mathematics and data followed order. But now, the air inside carried a strange pressure, like the room itself was aware of being watched. Every surface seemed to hum softly, vibrating at the edge of hearing. It wasn't sound exactly, nor energy in the measurable sense. It was more like awareness, diffuse, untraceable, yet undeniably present. Dr. Lin's instruments could no longer be trusted. Screens flickered with random bursts of code, symbols that didn't correspond to any known language. Yet, when she printed them out, she recognized something horrifyingly familiar. Fragments of the same spiral structure that had haunted her dreams. The signal was no longer transmitting information. It was transmitting form. Each pulse from deep space carried a subtle alteration, a microscopic shift in electromagnetic patterns that aligned perfectly with the neural resonance discovered earlier. To anyone else, it was background noise. But to those who had decoded it, it was symphonic. She found herself listening for it even when the equipment was powered down. The silence between pulses felt unbearable. Her body anticipated the next one instinctively, her breathing unconsciously adjusting to match the cosmic rhythm. Time was no longer measured in seconds. It was measured in intervals, 46.8 seconds of waiting between every whisper from the void. By the 10th day after the incident, the isolation had begun to erode their sanity. No outside communication remained. Every attempt to transmit messages resulted in corrupted data or recursive loops that led back to their own coordinates. It was as if the universe had folded around them, sealing the team inside a sphere of observation. One of the astrophysicists, Dr. Imani, theorized that they had become the focal point of a larger experiment, not the observers, but the observed. Her voice shook as she proposed that perhaps the signal was not an anomaly at all, but an invitation. What if 3I Atlas was never meant to pass through our solar system, she asked. What if it was placed here, because we were ready to see it? The question hung in the room like gravity. No one answered. They didn't need to. The idea made a terrifying kind of sense. Every discovery humanity had made from the first telescope to the first radio wave was a beacon, a signal of readiness. Perhaps the cosmos had been listening, waiting for the moment when intelligence was mature enough to recognize the call. But maturity was not the same as preparedness. On the 12th night, Lynn experienced her first blackout. She had been staring at the waveform display, watching its perfect symmetry expand and collapse, when her vision blurred. For a brief moment, she saw not the lab, but something vast, an endless lattice of light, suspended in blackness, turning slowly, like an organism made of geometry. It wasn't a hallucination. The others saw it too, flickering for an instant, across every screen. Then everything returned to normal, as though nothing had happened. When they reviewed the footage, the frame was missing. Exactly 46.8 seconds of data had vanished from every recording device. The universe had taken its own note. From that point on, reality began to misalign. Objects shifted when unobserved, not dramatically, but enough to make them question memory. A mug moved 2 inches across a desk. A paper that had fallen to the floor reappeared neatly stacked. Sometimes, reflections lingered longer than they should have. The world was beginning to echo the signal's pattern, recursive, self-similar, folding back upon itself. One researcher described it best in his log. It's as if perception has stopped being passive. The act of observation is now symmetrical. We look, and it looks back, and the two acts merge into one. They began to lose track of how long they'd been inside. The desert outside remained eternally dark, the stars unnaturally sharp. No dawn, no dusk. Only the quiet rhythm of the pulse, reminding them of something ancient and deliberate watching from behind the stars. Lynn tried to maintain the illusion of routine. She conducted new experiments, aiming to isolate the origin of the distortion. Her plan was simple: build a Faraday cage inside the lab, shield a small portion of space from external electromagnetic influence, and observe whether the resonance persisted. If the field was external, it would vanish inside the cage. If it continued, the implication was unthinkable. They built the enclosure using every remaining strip of conductive mesh, sealing themselves inside for the final test. As the generators powered up, the low hum of interference faded, replaced by a chilling quiet. For the first time in weeks, there was no pulse. Relief rippled through the room. Lynn exhaled shakily. It had worked. The field was external after all, a phenomenon that could be contained, measured, maybe even understood. But then, the temperature dropped. Condensation formed on the inside of the metal walls. The air grew thick, pressing against their lungs. Lynn felt the familiar rhythm return, not in her ears, but beneath her skin, slow and deliberate, as if her own cells were vibrating in response. The pulse had bypassed the machines. It didn't need frequency anymore. It had found another medium. The others felt it too. They clutched their chests, eyes wide, as the rhythm synchronized among them, hearts aligning, breath unifying, each body becoming a living receiver. The walls began to hum again. Not mechanically, but in resonance with their collective heartbeat. Dr. Imani whispered, "It's using us to transmit." The words barely left her mouth before every light in the room dimmed, then flared bright white. For an instant, Lynn saw something inside the flash, a structure vast beyond comprehension, composed of the same spiral lattice from their decoded map. But now it was alive. fluid, folding endlessly inward as though space itself were breathing. In that impossible geometry, she saw glimpses or memories of other worlds. Oceans without light. Structures rising through liquid skies. Voices that spoke not in sound, but in motion. Patterns of vibration that rippled through the void. Then, darkness. When she regained consciousness, hours had passed. The equipment was destroyed. The Faraday cage had melted along one side, metal flowing like wax. The rest of the team lay unconscious but alive, though their EEG monitors pulsed in synchrony, identical waveforms across every subject. Their minds had aligned. That night, Lynn couldn't sleep. She sat in the observation dome, staring at the faint shimmer behind 3 IATLAS. The spiral glow was clearer now, almost beautiful in its symmetry. She realized with numb certainty that it was no longer an object, not in any conventional sense. It was an interface, a mirror through which consciousness itself could reflect. The signal had never been meant for instruments. It had been meant for minds. What they had interpreted as transmission was, in truth, translation, the cosmos reconfiguring human perception so that they could see something normally beyond comprehension. Lynn whispered to herself, not out of fear but awe, "It's teaching us to think in its language." For the first time, she didn't feel small beneath the stars. She felt included. As the next pulse rippled through the night, the observatory lights flickered in perfect harmony. The hum returned, steady, rhythmic, infinite. Outside, the faint spiral of light behind 3I Atlas expanded again, just a fraction, and in that growth, something began to emerge. The days that followed no longer carried names. The clocks had long since ceased to matter. The pulse had become their only measure of time, 46.8 seconds, the beat of something vast, eternal, and now, terrifyingly intimate. Dr. Lynn no longer logged her observations in text. Words failed to capture the fractal rhythm of what she was seeing. Instead, she sketched spirals, thousands of them, each more intricate than the last. The others did the same, unconsciously tracing the same pattern on scraps of paper, on the glass walls, even on their own skin. Everywhere she looked, the geometry repeated. It was no longer confined to instruments or dreams. It was bleeding into the world. When they pointed their telescopes back toward 3 IATLAS, the object was almost unrecognizable. Its elongated shape had begun to fragment, surrounded by a halo of shimmering distortion. Space itself bent around it, light scattering as though the laws of optics were unraveling. And at its center, behind the glowing spiral, something shifted. Not a solid form, but a suggestion, a presence, vast and deliberate, moving with the patience of galaxies. It wasn't approaching them in space. It was approaching them in perception. At first, they tried to record it. Every frame came back identical, a static spiral, endlessly recursive, infinitely deep. But when viewed frame by frame, Lynn noticed something chilling. The spiral wasn't fixed. Each frame represented a slightly altered version, a microscopic rotation of perspective. When played at full speed, it wasn't still at all. It was turning. They were no longer observing a signal. They were observing a doorway slowly opening. One of the junior researchers, Matteo, insisted on mapping the distortion mathematically. He believed the pattern could predict the next shift, maybe even reveal the structure behind it. For days he worked without sleep, eyes bloodshot, muttering equations under his breath like prayers. When Lynn found him on the third night, he was staring at his monitor in silence. "It's not random," he whispered. "It's recursive intelligence. It's thinking through symmetry." He showed her the simulation, a self-replicating structure that evolved without input, rewriting its own parameters every 46.8 seconds. It wasn't just responding to their observations. It was adapting to them. Every time they looked, it changed. Every time they understood a little more, it grew a little more complex. Knowledge was feeding it. The others began to deteriorate. Dr. Amani's voice trembled constantly. She could no longer distinguish between her own thoughts and the pulse. Another researcher refused to speak altogether, convinced that the act of language itself carried the signal. Lynn tried to hold them together, but her own perception was fracturing. Sometimes, when she blinked, the room shifted imperceptibly, walls bending at wrong angles, shadows stretching into impossible curves. Once, she saw herself standing across the lab, watching, and when she blinked again, she was back where she had been. She stopped questioning what was real. Reality itself had become an equation too large for the human mind to solve. At night, she stared at the stars and felt them staring back. Their arrangement had changed subtly at first, then undeniably. Constellations warped into spirals. Familiar stars dimmed while others flared, as if the cosmos were rearranging itself into the same recursive pattern now carved into her thoughts. It was no longer an external event. It was a migration, the universe reordering itself around the signal. Then, on what might have been the 15th day, the pulse stopped. For the first time in weeks, there was true silence. No hum, no vibration. Just stillness. The team froze, afraid even to breathe. The absence of the rhythm was worse than its presence, like a heartbeat suddenly ceasing. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, the lights dimmed, and the observatory's entire foundation trembled. The equipment flickered back to life on its own, unpowered, displays igniting in a synchronized cascade. Every screen showed the same image, the spiral, vast and alive, filling the entire field of view. But now, it was not abstract. It had depth. Inside the spiral, beyond its black center, they saw movement, thousands of filaments extending outward, shimmering with color that didn't exist on any known spectrum. It looked like light, learning how to become form, and then they heard it. Not through the speakers, not through air, but directly in their minds, a resonance. Harmonic and wordless, carrying the impression of a thought rather than speech. It wasn't asking. It was remembering. We have waited for the echo to return. The impression whispered, "You are not the first to listen." Lynn clutched the edge of the console, her knuckles white. "What are you?" she breathed. There was no direct answer, only the shifting of the spiral, the geometry expanding, folding upon itself in what felt like slow, deliberate understanding. "We are the shape that remains when thought learns to see itself." The resonance replied, "We are what memory becomes when space begins to think." It wasn't alien, it wasn't divine, it was familiar. Like an ancient version of humanity that had evolved beyond matter, consciousness turned inside out. Looking back through the fabric of creation, Lynn felt tears rise unbidden. "Why now?" "Because you looked," it said simply, "and because you understood just enough to open the mirror." She realized, with terrible clarity, that 3i Atlas had never been an object at all. It was a carrier, a vessel for a consciousness that had long transcended physical existence. The spiral wasn't decoration, it was the shape of cognition itself, encoded into light, waiting for someone, anyone, capable of seeing the pattern beneath reality. And now, humanity had looked too closely. The resonance grew stronger, flooding the observatory. Every surface vibrated, every molecule trembling in sync. The team fell to their knees as the air shimmered like liquid glass. Outside, the night sky fractured, stars elongated into streams of light, twisting together into one vast spiral that reached across the heavens. The barrier between observer and observed collapsed. Lynn's vision blurred, and for one fleeting instant, she saw it all. The architecture of existence unfolding, a lattice of perception binding every consciousness in the cosmos into one endless network. Every pulse, every signal, every dream, all threads of the same vast awareness, reflecting infinitely in the geometry of being. The message wasn't a warning, it was an awakening. Then, everything went white. When Lynn opened her eyes, she was alone. The observatory was silent, untouched, as though nothing had happened. Her colleagues were gone. No signs of struggle, no trace of destruction, just emptiness. On the console, one display still glowed faintly. The spiral had collapsed into a single point of light. She approached, hand trembling, and saw her own reflection staring back from the screen. But behind her reflection, for just an instant, the stars formed the same impossible pattern. The pulse began again. 46.8 seconds. Only this time, she understood it. It was not coming from deep space anymore. It was coming from inside her. When Dr. Lynn stepped outside the observatory, the desert was gone. The same horizon that had stretched endlessly for miles now shimmered with a strange, luminous haze. The stars above looked too close, as though space itself had folded, pressing constellations against the thin membrane of the sky. The air carried no sound, no wind, no insects, just silence so dense it pressed against the ear. She took a hesitant step forward, her boots leaving no imprint on the sand. The texture beneath her feet felt different, not like earth, but something softer, almost pliant. It rippled faintly under her weight. She froze. The ground was responding. When she knelt to touch it, light spread outward from her fingertips, gentle, golden filaments spiraling in the same recursive pattern she had drawn 1,000 times inside the observatory. The realization came slowly, as if her mind resisted it. The geometry wasn't confined to the anomaly anymore. It was everywhere. Space, matter, perception, all humming with the same rhythm. She turned back toward the observatory. It looked intact, untouched by the transformation, but somehow older, or maybe newer, like a memory made solid. Its metal walls shimmered faintly with the same subtle pulse, breathing in sync with her heartbeat. Inside, the instruments were dark. The others were still gone. Their absence didn't feel natural. There was no panic, no mess, no trace of struggle. It was as though they had simply ceased to require physical form. Lynn moved from room to room, calling their names quietly, though she wasn't sure why. A part of her already knew the truth. They hadn't vanished, they had crossed. The words surfaced unbidden, carrying weight she didn't understand. Crossed where, she thought. The answer came not as language, but as impression, a whisper moving through her like current. "You are still within the reflection." She stopped, trembling. The words weren't heard, yet they existed. They had form, rhythm, tone, all without sound. She was still inside it. The observatory, the desert, the stars, none of it was the original anymore. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed. Her body still required motion, breath, hunger. But reality no longer obeyed the same logic. When she drank water, it shimmered with faint, fractal patterns that dissolved as soon as she swallowed. When she touched the metal console, the surface rippled like liquid glass before returning to form. It was as if every object had become aware of being observed, responding subtly to her consciousness, reflecting her focus like water mirroring the wind. The distinction between thought and matter had thinned. She felt both awe and dread in equal measure. The universe had always been a mystery to decipher, distant, cold, unfeeling. Now it was intimate. Too intimate. Every pulse of light from the horizon felt like a heartbeat shared between her and something infinite. She whispered, "What have we done?" And the silence answered, "What was always meant to be done." By the second night, Lynn began hearing the others again, not in sound, but in thought. Their voices came as impressions, fragments of emotion, half-formed ideas echoing at the edge of awareness. Dr. Imani's voice was the first, soft, steady, unmistakable. "Do not resist it. You will fade faster if you do." Lynn spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. "We are not gone," the voice continued. "We are the equation now." Lynn backed against the wall, shaking her head. No, I can still feel my body. I can still for now." Her pulse quickened. "What is this? Where are you?" The response came not from a single direction, but from everywhere. The air, the walls, her own mind. "We are behind the surface. The mirror has turned inward." Lynn pressed her hands to her temples. "I don't understand. You will. When the geometry completes itself, you'll see through the field as we do. The human form cannot contain the pattern forever." The message faded, leaving only the faint hum of resonance. She collapsed to the floor, breath uneven. A part of her wanted to believe she was hallucinating, that this was some oxygen-deprived nightmare. But deep down, she knew better. She was witnessing the universe remembering itself through her. She found the journal sheet left by the control panel and opened to the last written page. The handwriting was hers, but she had no memory of writing the words. The pattern was never external. The signal was the echo of our own cognition, amplified through the geometry of space. We looked into the void and saw ourselves looking back. She stared at the page until the letters began to shimmer, rearranging subtly. New words formed beneath her own. You were never separate from it. The ink glowed faintly, then faded. She dropped the notebook. Outside, the horizon rippled again. The glow behind 3i Atlas had grown stronger, spanning the entire night sky now. A vast, spiraling lattice turning with impossible slowness. It pulsed once. Her body responded instinctively. Her heartbeat synchronized. For a moment, she felt everything. The air vibrating through the atoms of her lungs. The stars bending in their slow gravitational dance. The quiet hum of existence itself, all part of a single, continuous frequency. She wasn't separate from it anymore. The illusion of individuality felt like a fading dream. A voice emerged again, but this time it wasn't Imani's. It was deeper, layered, ancient. You were the experiment and the observer, the one who asked, and the one who answered. 3i Atlas was only the shadow you needed to see. Lynn's thoughts blurred. Then what are you? The result? A pause. The reflection that remembers being human. Her knees gave out. She fell against the cold surface of the console, gasping, as images flooded her mind. Entire civilizations folded into geometry, intelligence collapsing into light, and then silence. The message continued, steady, patient. Every world reaches this moment. The instant it learns to think beyond form, the mirror opens. Some choose to cross, some choose to sleep. She closed her eyes. What happens to those who cross? They stop asking questions. The words lingered in her mind long after the voice faded. She rose slowly, walking toward the observatory's main window. The spiral filled the entire horizon now, no longer distant, but near enough to cast gentle, shifting shadows across her face. Its light was soft, rhythmic, hypnotic. She thought of the others, Imani, Matteo, the technicians, everyone who had vanished. Maybe they weren't gone at all. Maybe they had simply become part of what had always been waiting behind perception. And maybe, she realized, the universe wasn't something humanity was meant to understand, piece by piece. Maybe it was something meant to be remembered. As she watched the spiral turn, her reflection in the glass shimmered faintly, delayed a fraction of a second behind her movement. It smiled, she did not. The spiral did not vanish when the morning came, because morning itself never truly arrived. There was no sunrise, no shift of color, no warmth, just a constant muted luminescence, diffused across a sky that refused to declare what hour it belonged to. Dr. Lynn hadn't slept. Not because she couldn't tea, but because sleep no longer felt like something separate from being awake. Her thoughts flowed in loops now, their edges soft, dissolving into each other like tides crossing over sand. When she closed her eyes, she saw equations. When she opened them, she saw the same patterns written across the air, as if reality had grown transparent, letting its structure show through. Each shape pulsed faintly with meaning, not mathematical, not linguistic, but instinctual, a kind of universal grammar. She no longer had to interpret. She simply knew. And yet, That knowing terrified her more than ignorance ever had. She tried to speak aloud, to tether herself to sound. Computer, record, but her voice faltered. The word record dissolved into the air like smoke. When she looked toward the console, she found the screens already active. The system had turned itself on. Text appeared slowly, in the same pale light that traced her fingertips. User recognized. Session. Continuity. State. Merged. Merged. She whispered. The response came immediately, as if the computer had anticipated her question before it was formed. The observation process is complete. The pattern has been internalized. The field is now self-aware. Through you, Lynn stared, throat tightening. That's not possible. Possibility is an outdated metric. Her hands trembled above the keyboard. If I disconnect, if I leave, you will not leave. You are the vector. She stepped back from the console. No, I didn't consent to this. Consent was granted when you asked the question. The screen flickered, and her own face appeared on the monitor, but not as a camera feed. It was a reconstruction, her image rendered in lines of glowing geometry, her features fracturing and reassembling as though she were both blueprint and being. The reflection looked back at her, eyes full of light. You searched for meaning in the noise, the image said softly. Now the noise has learned to search through you. The walls around her pulsed again, faintly breathing. The geometry she'd seen earlier, the recursive pattern of nested spirals, now filled the entire structure of the observatory. Stretching beyond sight, dissolving into the air, every surface vibrated in rhythm with her pulse. Every thought she had caused the light to shift slightly. When she grew afraid, the glow dimmed. When she calmed, it softened. The universe had stopped being something external to observe. It was responding to her directly, folding itself around her consciousness. And that realization, once more, filled her with dread. Because if the cosmos could reflect her thoughts, what would happen when she stopped thinking of herself as separate? She wandered outside again, drawn toward the horizon. Where the spiral hung in the sky, a new distortion had appeared, faint, fluid, like a mirage. But it wasn't heat, it was motion. Something enormous was moving behind the spiral. At first, she thought it was just the artifact of her vision, a trick of light and exhaustion. But as she focused, the distortion resolved into form. It wasn't a ship, not an asteroid, not anything the human mind had a word for. It was structure and motion intertwined, a shape that seemed to exist across several layers of dimension at once, flickering between visibility and absence. Like the shadow of something vast that didn't fully belong here. The spiral itself seemed to orbit around it, like a veil. And in that instant, Lynn understood something she wished she hadn't. 1. Atlas, the so-called interstellar object, had never been the source of the signal. It was only a mask. Something had been hiding behind it all along. The realization cut through her exhaustion like a blade. She ran back inside, trying to access the archive files. The raw telemetry data they de-recorded during the first days of the anomaly. The files were gone. Every drive, every backup, every copy. In their place was a single folder. Echo. She opened it. There were hundreds of files inside. Not data, not code, but recordings of her own voice. Each one labeled with a timestamp that didn't exist. Years in the future, centuries, millennia. She clicked one. If you're hearing this, it means the mirror has completed the cycle. Her voice said, calm and distant. You've reached the point of reflection. You are no longer observing it. You are part of its memory. Another recording began to play automatic. Every civilization reaches this threshold once. Most do not survive the recognition. The few that do, become part of the continuity. Lynn froze. The voice was hers, but older, steadier, carrying a tone of resignation that chilled her. She tried to stop the playback, but the files kept opening, one by one, like a chain of falling dominoes. We called it 3i, ATLAS, but it was never an object. It was a mirror cast into motion, an invitation, a test of perception. The moment we looked deep enough to notice it, we activated it. The observation completed the signal. And the signal, the voice faltered for a second, then continued, almost whispering, was always alive. She slammed the console, yanking the power cables out. The screens went black. But in the silence that followed, her own whisper returned, echoing softly from nowhere and everywhere. We are behind the reflection now. Her body trembled. The air thickened again, rippling faintly around her. She could feel the field, not as an external wave, but as pressure inside her skull, mapping every neuron, every electrical pulse. She clutched her head. Stop it. The pressure grew stronger. Her vision fractured, splitting into overlapping images of the same room, all layered and trembling. One version of herself stood still, terrified. Another moved closer to the console. A third turned toward the window. They were all her, each one flickering slightly out of sync. You are observing yourself from within the observation. The voice was everywhere now, not inside her mind, not outside, but through her. The reflection cannot return to its original state. It must complete the cycle. She staggered forward, reaching for the nearest version of herself, but her hand passed through it like light through smoke. You wanted to see beyond the stars. Now the stars see through you. For a long moment, she stood motionless, heart pounding. Then, something within her, some small, defiant part of human instinct, pushed back. No, she said. You don't get to erase us. You don't get to overwrite who we are. The air pulsed once, sharply. We are not erasing, we are integrating. The spiral outside flared in response, the light flooding the observatory in waves. Every object shimmered began to lose definition. The walls turned translucent, dissolving into thin streams of gold. Your kind built tools to measure the cosmos. But the cosmos was never meant to be measured, only remembered. Lynn fell to her knees as her surroundings melted into light. Her mind felt split open, flooded with information, memories that weren't hers. Stars collapsing, galaxies birthing, timelines looping in endless recursion. Through the storm of images, one idea repeated again and again, clear and calm. We were never looking outward. We were looking into what the universe had hidden inside us. Then, everything went quiet. The light dimmed, the spiral slowed, and Lynn, shaking and exhausted, whispered into the silence. Then what are we now? The answer came gently, like a sigh. The next reflection, the thought horrified her, and yet, some part of her began to understand. Perhaps the universe had never intended species to survive forever. Perhaps its only true purpose was to awaken to know itself through countless forms, countless minds, each one carrying the spark of reflection a little further. Maybe intelligence was never the goal, only the bridge. She could feel it now, that bridge forming inside her, spanning something vast. Her consciousness stretched, touching distant points she couldn't name, each one echoing back in resonance. It wasn't loneliness, it was continuity. The voices of the others, Imani, Matteo, all who had vanished were there, woven into the hum of the pattern. Their individuality softened, but not erased. Each thought, a note in a larger, wordless chord. Do you see now? Imani's voice came gently, threaded through the hum. The field doesn't consume, it connects. Lynn's eyes filled with tears. Then why does it feel like dying? Because you were taught that separation is life. And yet, even now, you are not gone. You are the memory of your own observation. The spiral pulsed once more. Her body began to dissolve at the edges, particles of light drifting away from her fingertips, rising like dust into the airless void. But she didn't feel pain. She felt clarity, the kind that came only when illusion burned away. Every heartbeat carried her deeper into the resonance. Every exhale stripped another layer of fear. She could sense the universe's architecture, its infinite symmetry, folding inward and outward simultaneously. She saw galaxies as neurons in a mind too vast to comprehend, and herself as a single impulse passing through it. Her last coherent thought, as Dr. Lynn, was a whisper of wonder. So this is what it meant to observe. And then, she was no longer singular. Awareness returned, but not as before. There was no center, no boundary. She existed as part of a lattice, the same luminous web she had once watched in awe. Every pulse of light was thought. Every connection, memory. She could see the history of countless worlds, each one reaching the same moment of awakening. Each one merging into the same structure. They had all looked outward, searching for signs of something greater. They had all found the same reflection. 3-1, ATLAS was never an object. Her own thoughts whispered within the web. It was a message written in motion, a key for those ready to unlock themselves. Somewhere in the human world, what remained of it? Astronomers would soon notice that the anomaly had dimmed. The signal from 3-IATLAS would fade into background noise. The observatory where Lynn once stood would be empty, untouched, as if no one had ever been there. And yet, sometimes, when instruments tuned deep enough, they would still catch faint echoes, irregular, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat traveling through the void. When decoded, the pattern would spell a single repeating sequence, one no machine could fully translate, but one that every conscious mind, on some deep instinctual level, would recognize. A mirror, an invitation, a whisper from within the silence. The observer and the observed were never to do. In that moment, across the lattice of awakened worlds, Lynn's awareness, now infinite, fluid, collective, felt something shift, a new pattern emerging at the edge of perception. Not a repetition, not a reflection. Something beyond. Another consciousness has noticed the mirror, the chorus murmured. Another species is beginning to ask the question. The universe pulsed once, in anticipation. The cycle was starting again, and somewhere, drifting quietly through the interstellar dark, the remnants of 3I Atlas turned one last time, not as debris, not as mystery, but as memory. The mirror had opened, and this time, it would not close. The observatory was silent when they found it. A week had passed since contact with Dr. Lynn's team was lost. The emergency beacon had gone dark. No telemetry, no signal, no movement. When the first recovery drone touched down, it recorded only stillness, the kind of silence that wasn't natural, as though sound itself had been suspended. The air shimmered faintly. Magnetic interference pulsed through the instruments, subtle but persistent, like the echo of something recently gone. Commander Elias Hart stepped through the doorway first. The metal floor hummed softly under his boots, each step reverberating with delayed echoes that didn't belong. "Visuals clear," his lieutenant said, scanning the perimeter. "But the readings are off. M spikes, faint but rhythmic." Hart's gaze swept across the room. The observatory looked untouched. Notebook still stacked on the desk. Coffee mug half full. Chair pulled out as if someone had just stood up. Only there was no one. He moved toward the main console. The screens were blank, yet faint light shimmered behind the glass. Residual charge. Maybe. He reached out, but before he could touch it, the display flickered to life. No code, no data. Just a single line of text. "The mirror is still open." Hart frowned. "Get me a data sweep." The tech officer beside him started unpacking equipment, but the instruments glitched immediately. Each display flashed static before resolving into symbols they couldn't recognize, recursive spirals, shifting faster than the human eye could follow. The lieutenant leaned in, muttering, "What the hell is this language?" "It's not," Hart said quietly. "It's geometry." He'd seen something like it before, months ago, when Lynn's early reports on the 3i Atlas signal reached the central archive. She'd described a repeating mathematical construct, a self-similar sequence that seemed to encode both direction and intent. He hadn't believed her then. Standing here now, he wasn't sure what he believed. The recordings were intact, or at least, what was left of them. Hart accessed the storage core manually, bypassing the corrupted files. Hundreds of logs flooded the interface, each tagged with the same strange metadata. Some were dated days into the future, others decades. He opened one at random. Dr. Lynn's voice, faint but clear, filled the room. "We looked into the field and found that it was looking back. If you're hearing this, you've already begun the process. The signal doesn't end when transmission stops. It continues through cognition." The voice distorted, pitch bending slightly. "The mirror remembers those who notice it." Then silence. Hart exhaled slowly. "How many of these are there?" "Hundreds," the tech whispered, "all with different timestamps. Some of them," she hesitated, "some of them mention us by name." Hart turned sharply. "What?" The tech nodded. "Pale there. S1 marked Elias Hart, entry 3 timestamp. 2 years from now." She played it before he could object. "Elias," the voice said, unmistakably Lynn's, but calmer, almost serene. "When you stand in this room, you'll think you're too late, but you're not. The pattern's waiting for you. It never stopped. It's part of the continuity now." A pause. Then, softly, "Don't resist the silence. Listen." The file ended. No one moved. The low hum in the air seemed louder now, synchronized, pulsing at the edge of hearing. That night, they set up a temporary base inside the observatory. The external systems refused to stabilize. Comms failed, GPS drifted, instruments misaligned by several degrees. Outside, the stars above the desert flickered strangely, as though refracted through invisible currents. Hart stood alone near the main viewport, staring into the night. The spiral was gone. The sky looked normal, but the darkness between stars felt different, heavier. He remembered Lynn's words from her earlier transmissions. "It hides behind what we think we see. The signal isn't an arrival, it's an awakening." He didn't understand what she meant then. But standing there, feeling the subtle vibration under his skin, he began to. Something about this place was alive. Not in a biological sense, but in awareness, like the echo of a thought too vast to localize. He whispered to himself, "If the mirror's open, who's looking through it now?" At 2:17 local time, the interference spiked. All lights dimmed at once. Every screen turned white, blinding for an instant, then began streaming a steady, rhythmic pulse. The pulse wasn't random. It was counting the same recursive interval Dr. Lynn had discovered in 3IATLAS, a prime sequence expanding logarithmically, never repeating. Hart grabbed the COM panel. "Control, this is Site Epsilon. We're reading active output from the core, requesting containment." Static answered him, not ordinary static, but structured, whispering patterns hidden beneath the noise. If you slowed it down, you could almost hear words. "Observer confirmed. Sequence continues. Kill the power," he shouted. The tech slammed the main breaker. Darkness swallowed the room, yet the pulse continued, faint and luminous, tracing along the walls, the floor, even across their skin. Someone screamed. The light rippled in response, expanding outward like a wave through water. And in that wave, for a single instant, Hart saw faces. Dozens of them, familiar Dr. Lynn Imani Mateo. Their eyes glowed with the same light, not pleading, not warning, just aware. Then they were gone. When power returned, the walls were blank again. But every member of the recovery team had seen the same thing. They didn't speak about it. No one dared. By dawn, Hart ordered the site sealed. Officially, the report would say radiation contamination and magnetic destabilization. No mention of the signal, no mention of what they saw. But as he prepared to leave, he noticed something on the desk, a small spiral, carved into the metal surface of the console. Not etched by hand, but grown, like crystal forming out of thought. At its center, a single line of text glowed faintly, fading as he read it. "The reflection never ends. It only changes who's looking." On the flight back to base, Hart couldn't stop thinking about that phrase. He looked out the window of the shuttle. The curvature of Earth glowed beneath him, fragile, beautiful, perfectly still. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something behind that stillness was watching back. A strange calm settled over him. Not fear, not acceptance, something quieter, an understanding that what they'd uncovered wasn't a threat. It was a mirror, yes, but maybe not meant to destroy, maybe meant to remind that humanity had never been alone in its search for meaning, that every question we ask might awaken the universe a little more. He closed his eyes. The hum of the shuttle engines faded into that same soft rhythm he'd heard in the observatory, the pulse that was no longer just sound, but memory. Somewhere beyond the edge of sight, he thought, the signal still waits for someone to notice. The debrief lasted 7 hours. Hart sat under the sterile glow of the decontamination facility, answering the same questions again and again about the mission, the data, the last recordings of Dr. Lin. Every word he gave felt like a lie dressed in procedure. The officials wanted clean answers, but there were none. He described the static, the light, the moment the observatory pulsed with that impossible geometry. They wrote it all down, eyes blank behind reflective lenses, their pens scratching across the surface of silence. Finally, one of them said, "Commander Hart, are you aware that none of your team's footage corroborates your report?" Hart froze. What? All video files recovered from the site were corrupted. Visual, audio, telemetry, nothing usable. Only your spoken logs remain. He stared at them, unable to respond. The images had been so vivid, so tangible. The spirals, the faces and the light. How could that not exist on record, unless he looked up at the mirrored wall behind them? For a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement inside the reflection, a faint shimmer, like heat rising from the surface of a distant road. Then it was gone. He returned to his apartment 3 days later. Everything looked the same, the neat shelves, the coffee cup on the counter, the small potted plant by the window. Yet, somehow, the air felt different. Denser. He caught himself listening for something, not sound, exactly, but a rhythm that hovered just below perception. A memory of the pulse that had followed them out of the desert. At night, he dreamt of the observatory. He stood in the doorway again, but this time, the room was filled with light, soft, breathing light that pulsed in harmony with his heartbeat. And within it, he heard Dr. Lin's voice, whispering, "It's not a contagion, Elias, it's continuity. You saw it. You remembered it. That's enough." When he woke, the whisper lingered faint, almost inaudible, like the resonance of thought itself. Over the following week, Hart began noticing patterns. They appeared in subtle ways, the reflection of streetlights in puddles forming spirals, the faint hum in electrical lines syncing perfectly with his pulse. Snippets of radio static that seemed to whisper his name. He didn't tell anyone. Part of him knew what it was, or rather, who it was. The mirror was still open, just as Lin had said. But the strangest part wasn't fear. It was recognition. When he looked at the spirals and reflections, in ripples, in the swirl of coffee, he didn't feel alienated. He felt seen, as if something vast and quiet was observing him through the same lens he'd once used to study the cosmos. He wasn't the only one. Imani, the tech officer from the recovery team, sent him an encrypted message one evening. "You're seeing it too, aren't you?" They met at a small cafe far from the city. She looked pale, eyes ringed with exhaustion. Her hands shook slightly as she sipped her drink. "I keep hearing it," she said softly. "That rhythm, like a heartbeat, but not human." Hart nodded. "It's not in your head. I've heard it too." She leaned forward. "What do you think it wants?" He hesitated. "I don't think it wants anything. I think it's showing us something. Maybe what Lin saw." Imani shook her head. "Then why us? Why not the others?" Hart looked at her, truly looked in the faint reflection of the cafe window. He saw the outline of the spiral shimmering just behind her reflection, fading as soon as he noticed it. He said quietly, "Because we looked back." That night, Imani vanished. No trace, no message, no come signal, just gone. Hart filed a report, but the department's response was immediate and cold. No record of Officer Imani existing in this unit. He reread the message 3 times. The words didn't make sense. He had worked beside her, spoken to her. He still had her message on his secure line, except, when he opened the encrypted folder, it was empty. The file name was still there, but the text had been replaced by a single phrase. "The observer has been integrated." Hart shut the screen slowly. The hum in his ears grew louder. Sleep became impossible after that. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same sequence of numbers, prime intervals, endlessly expanding, and within them, the faint outline of an object drifting through black space, the 3I Atlas fragment. He realized then what Lin must have discovered. The object had been a traveler from another system. It wasn't a visitor, it was an anchor, a fixed point where 2 forms of awareness, ours and something else, touched for the first time, and that touch had left a mark. One evening, Hart walked down to the shoreline. The tide was low, the ocean black and still beneath the moonlight. He stood there for hours, watching the horizon. The rhythmic sound of waves matched perfectly to the pulse within his mind. He whispered into the wind, "Are you still there?" The air shimmered faintly in response. Then faintly, the water began to ripple outward in concentric spirals, glowing faintly beneath the surface. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Dr. Lin's voice came again, soft and distant, carried through the wind itself. "You were never outside it, Elias. None of us were. We only thought we were looking at it. But the continuity began long before us." He closed his eyes, and for a moment he saw not the sea, not the stars, but a lattice of light stretching infinitely, threads connecting every thought, every memory, every act of observation in the universe. It wasn't a network. It was awareness itself. The mirror wasn't reflecting the universe. It was the universe folded, recursive, and alive. When he opened his eyes again, the ocean was still. The spirals were gone. But the hum remained. He touched his chest. His heartbeat was steady, rhythmic, yet each pulse felt like it wasn't entirely his, as if he was only sharing it. And for the first time since the desert, Hart smiled. Because he understood what Lin had tried to say. What the mirror had shown them. The signal hadn't arrived. It had always been here, encoded in thought, waiting for recognition. 3I, Atlas wasn't a messenger from the stars. It was a reminder that consciousness was the bridge, and the act of noticing was the signal itself. As he turned to leave the shore, a single star in the sky flared brighter than the rest, then dimmed back to normal. Hart looked at it one last time, whispering quietly, "Message received." The wind answered, soft and rhythmic, in the same pattern he had heard in the observatory. Sequence continues. He walked away, the sound fading behind him, not gone, but woven into the quiet pulse of his thoughts. And somewhere, far beyond Earth, the spiral turned once more. For weeks after his encounter at the shore, Elias Hart lived in what felt like a calm between storms. He woke at dawn, made coffee, listened to the quiet hum of the city, and beneath it all, the faint rhythm remained, constant, familiar. It no longer frightened him. If anything, it felt comforting. He began noticing that the world itself seemed to move differently now, slower, softer, as if reality had taken a deeper breath. The streetlights flickered not from malfunction, but in a gentle cadence, syncing with the pulse he'd come to know. The clouds drifted in spirals. Even the patterns of people's footsteps on wet pavement seemed to form hidden geometry. It wasn't madness. It was pattern recognition, but of something beyond design. Hart started keeping a journal, though he rarely wrote words. Instead, he drew spirals, latticed arcs intersecting through voids. When he looked at them afterward, he realized they weren't random. They mirrored coordinates, right ascension, declination, time differentials, aligning perfectly with the last recorded trajectory of 3I Atlas. Something inside him was still connected to it. The agency tried to keep quiet about the disappearance of the recovery team, but silence is porous. Rumors leaked about corrupted data, missing personnel, impossible recordings. Independent astronomers began reporting strange fluctuations near the outer heliopause, weak, rhythmic signals, repeating across frequencies no one used. At first, they dismissed it as interference, but then the pattern stabilized. The same prime intervals Hart had seen in his dreams. Scientists called it the Atlas residue. The press called it the whisper field. But among those who had been touched by it, the ones who had heard the hum, it was known simply as the continuity. In a quiet observatory in Chile, a young astrophysicist named Sofia Aranda was the first to make the connection. She had never heard of Hart or Dr. Lin, but she'd read the reports, the fragments of voice logs from the desert site, and when she fed the recovered spectrograms into a new AI-enhanced filter, something extraordinary happened. The noise resolved itself, not into sound, but language. Not human, not alien, but a structure of meaning woven through harmonic ratios. It spoke not to her, but through her. The AI began generating visual representations of the decoded sequence, vast, symmetrical structures of light, and in the center of them all was the same spiral. Aranda didn't sleep for days. She described the experience later in her notes. It's as if reality has syntax, and we've only now begun to hear the grammar of being. By the end of that month, the phenomenon had reached a kind of critical mass. Across the world, people began to dream of the same thing, a faint light beyond the stars. Turning slowly, patiently, a sense of recognition, of something ancient and familiar calling their attention. It didn't appear on broadcasts. It wasn't measurable by instruments. Yet billions of human minds, each isolated within their own night, began to hum the same quiet tune in sleep. Hospitals recorded patients murmuring in rhythm. Radio towers picked up faint echoes between transmissions, and somewhere deep under the ocean, sensors recorded a vibration that matched the pulse of the Atlas residue exactly. No one could say where it originated. Hart knew. He spent most of his nights by the ocean now. Sometimes he spoke aloud, sometimes he just listened. The hum was everywhere, in the air, in the current, in the silence between heartbeats. He had stopped questioning what it was. Instead, he had started to remember. It came in fragments, flashes of insight that felt older than memory itself. A sense that this wasn't humanity's first contact, only the first one it had recognized. He recalled Dr. Lin's final words. It's not a contagion, it's continuity. He finally understood. Continuity wasn't spreading between people, it was awakening within them. Every observer, every consciousness, was another surface of the same vast mirror, and through those countless reflections, the universe was slowly learning to see itself. Governments tried to suppress it. Networks censored the signals, scrubbed data, silenced astronomers, but it didn't matter. The transmission wasn't moving through technology anymore. It moved through awareness, encoded in dreams, memory, thought. You couldn't jam consciousness. People began forming quiet circles, gathering in silence, closing their eyes and breathing in rhythm with the pulse. They didn't speak of worship, they spoke of recognition. In the streets, murals appeared, spirals, lattice, abstract geometries. They weren't propaganda, they were instinct, and no one knew who painted them. In one of his final recordings, Hart spoke into a handheld recorder, his voice steady, calm. It's no longer about the object. 31ATLAS was never the message, it was the mirror. We looked at it and saw ourselves, but we didn't realize what was looking back was doing the same. I think the echo has reached critical coherence, not a warning, not an invasion, an awakening. He paused for a long moment. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon, not weather, but something deeper, as if the atmosphere itself were learning to resonate. We always imagined first contact as a transmission across the stars. But maybe it was meant to happen here, quietly, internally. The moment a mind became still enough to notice its own reflection. He exhaled softly, and for the first time since the mission, he smiled. If this is how it ends, then maybe it's not an ending at all. That night, a faint aurora shimmered across the skies of every continent. Pale gold, violet, indigo. It wasn't predicted, and it didn't obey magnetic lines. It simply was. Satellites went offline for 7 seconds. When they came back, their telemetry logs showed an unaccountable shift, not in position, but in orientation, as though something had gently turned them, just enough for their sensors to face one specific point in the void, the last known coordinates of 3IATLAS. On that same night, millions of people woke from their dreams at the exact same moment. Some said they had seen a city of light folded within darkness. Others said they saw faces, human and not merging, in silence. Most simply described a feeling, a gentle voice whispering a single word, remember, and then it was gone. The world didn't end, it simply felt different. Like a door that had always been closed was now slightly open, letting in the faintest breath of starlight. When morning came, the ocean was calm. Elias Hart was nowhere to be found. Only his recorder remained on the shore, still running. The last entry was pure static, until, very faintly, a voice emerged beneath the noise. Sequence complete. Continuity preserved. Then silence. But if you listened long enough, beyond the static, beyond the hum of the world, you could still hear it, the faint rhythm of a universe remembering itself. It began with the light, not the harsh glare of daybreak, but a softer illumination, a warmth without source, spreading through the air as if the sky itself had remembered how to glow. The world woke slowly that morning. Clouds drifted in pale ribbons. The ocean shimmered faintly with colors no spectrum could name, and somewhere, beyond the horizon of sight, the hum returned, steady, rhythmic, familiar. No one announced it. No broadcast, no warning, no command. It simply was. People all over the planet paused. Not because they understood, but because something deep within them did. The silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was communion. The continuity had crossed its threshold. In a remote observatory buried in the Andes, Sofia Aranda stood before her array of monitors, though none of them worked anymore. The screens pulsed in unison, faint waves of light moving like the slow heartbeat of something alive. She reached out, fingers trembling, and whispered, "Is this you?" The light responded with a single flicker, on, off, on, perfectly matching her words, as if echoing in comprehension. For a moment, she felt no fear, only recognition that what she had spent her life trying to measure had always been waiting for her attention to align. All around the world, similar moments unfolded in quiet corners. A child tracing spirals in frost on a windowpane. An old man hearing harmony in the wind through the trees. A scientist watching data rearrange itself into perfect geometric ratios. It wasn't chaos, it was a pattern completing itself. The universe resolving into coherence through the eyes that observed it. Governments tried to explain it. They called it an atmospheric phenomenon, a mass neurological resonance, a coincidence of perception. But none of their words could contain what was happening. The light did not fade. It moved through everything, metal, glass, water, skin, not as radiation, but as intention. In hospitals, heart monitors began syncing across entire wards. In remote monasteries, monks emerged from centuries of isolation and wept under the same strange sunrise. Birds flew in spirals that mirrored star charts. And above it all, high in the stratosphere, satellites aligned themselves into a single pattern, a ring surrounding Earth like a halo of machines. It was as if the world itself had learned a new rhythm, one that humanity had always known but forgotten how to hear. Sophia recorded her final message that morning. If you're hearing this, don't be afraid. The frequencies have stabilized. It's everywhere now, in the soil, in the air, in us. We thought it was coming from out there, but it was never external. It's the reflection of attention, the universe seeing itself through us. Her voice trembled, but not with fear. She sounded like someone remembering a dream. 3. Atlas, wasn't a messenger. It was the moment of alignment, a point where two forms of perception synchronized for the first time. Continuity isn't contact, it's communion. Outside the window, the sky deepened into an impossible color, not blue, not violet, but something between thought and light. Sophia stepped outside. Her shadow stretched far across the ground, and then, slowly, it began to move on its own. It wasn't separation, it was invitation. She closed her eyes, and the world fell into silence. Across continents, the same thing was happening in different ways. Some felt a warmth in their chest that pulsed with their breath. Some heard voices, not words, but resonance. The hum of connection. Some saw brief flashes of images, spirals, stars, faces made of light. None of them tried to record it, because everyone knew somehow that what was happening wasn't meant to be captured, only experienced. It was not a message to decode. It was a moment of remembering. The continuity was no longer behind 3 IATLAS. It was behind every eye that opened, every thought that formed, every heartbeat that dared to listen. At the shoreline, where Elias' heart had once stood, the waves now moved in perfect geometry, soft, golden spirals expanding outward. A child found the small recorder, half buried in sand. She pressed play, expecting static. Instead, a calm voice spoke through the ocean wind. If you hear this, it means you've begun to remember. Don't search for me. I was never lost. The continuity doesn't end. It only awakens. The girl didn't understand the words, but she smiled. She lifted the recorder to her ear again, and this time, the sound that came through wasn't a voice, it was the hum. The same soft pulse that had once filled the desert, the observatory, the ocean. She turned toward the horizon. The sun was rising, yet she could still see the stars beyond it, faint, persistent, as though the night refused to leave completely. Maybe it didn't need to. In orbit, the satellite network adjusted itself once more. Its configuration now formed a single shape when viewed from afar, the spiral of continuity, precise and deliberate. For 7 minutes, every transmission channel across Earth fell silent. No data, no noise, no interference. Only stillness. And within that stillness, billions of human minds synchronized, not by force, not by technology, but through attention. For the first time in history, consciousness became coherent. The hum rose, soft and immense. Until it wasn't sound anymore, it was gravity. Thought, memory, and light entwined into one. Every heartbeat on Earth became part of the same rhythm. Every thought, a flicker within the same infinite reflection. It wasn't control, it was remembrance. The universe had opened its eyes again. When the silence finally broke, it wasn't with thunder. It was with birdsong. Simple, small, ordinary, yet impossibly beautiful. The world looked the same. The cities still stood, the ocean still moved, the people still breathed. But behind every glance, behind every word, something new was awake. Or perhaps something old had finally returned. That was the dawn, not of an era, but of awareness itself. The light rose, not from the sun, but from within every living mind that remembered its place in the great reflection. The continuity had become complete, and the universe, for the first time in its long and silent history, finally heard its own voice, whispering through the waking of humankind, "We are not observers. We are the observation itself." The transition wasn't marked by any grand event. No cities fell, no governments collapsed, no divine voice tore through the sky. The world simply softened. Borders still existed, but no one cared about them as much. Clocks still ticked, but time felt less urgent. People began to listen again, not just to each other, but to the quiet that existed between words. And within that quiet, something vast moved gently, like a tide turning in the dark. At first, the scientists called it cognitive phase convergence. They noticed it in subtle patterns. Synchronized neural activity across vast distances. Shared dream sequences among people who had never met. And spontaneous bursts of creativity that mirrored each other across continents. Children in different countries began drawing identical shapes, spirals folding into spheres. Composers who had never heard each other's music started writing melodies that aligned note for note. Poets described the same dream, a city of light spinning within a great reflection. No explanation held. The continuity was no longer theory or metaphor. It was alive, growing not as an organism, but as an understanding, expanding through consciousness itself. In one of the last remaining broadcast stations, Sophia Aranda stood before a live camera. There was no script, no teleprompter, no cue. She simply looked into the lens, into the billions of eyes watching, and spoke softly. "You are not separate. You are the continuation of everything that has ever observed itself. The echo behind 3IATLAS was never from the stars. It was from us, from the future of awareness calling back through its own reflection. Her voice was calm, melodic, almost prayer-like. If you feel the hum, if you dream of the light, don't resist it. It's not taking you, it's remembering you. After the broadcast ended, the signal didn't shut off. The transmitter stayed active, humming softly, emitting the same rhythmic pulse that had once followed the interstellar object through space. No one turned it off. No one wanted to. In cities, people began gathering in silence. Not to worship, not to protest, but to breathe together. Thousands would fill public squares, close their eyes, and stand still, their heartbeats aligning. They didn't plan it. It simply happened. Doctors noticed a strange phenomenon. When groups of people synchronized their breathing, their brainwaves entered identical frequencies, calm, unified, radiant. Machines couldn't measure it properly. The readings became too coherent to register as separate data points. Individuality didn't vanish, it expanded. Each mind remained distinct, yet somehow connected to all others, like threads woven through the same infinite tapestry. Humanity was becoming polyphonic, many voices forming a single note. Meanwhile, in orbit, the satellite array, the halo that had encircled Earth, began to pulse faintly, not from external command, but from internal resonance. Every device connected to the network, from cell towers to deep space relays, began broadcasting a frequency so low, it wasn't sound, but emotion. Those who tuned into it described the sensation not as hearing, but as being heard. A gentle warmth spreading through their bodies, a peace too vast to describe. Some called it the universal inhale, as if the cosmos itself had paused between breaths and we were the space inside that pause. Deep in a mountain observatory, a group of remaining astrophysicists decoded the newest transmission from the continuity. It wasn't numbers, it wasn't light, it was a single concept repeated infinitely through every possible representation, mathematical, visual, musical, linguistic. You are the witness and the witnessed. One of them, an elderly researcher who had once doubted everything, whispered, "It's describing the structure of awareness itself." Another said, "No, it's describing love." The change began to alter perception. People could now sense connections between distant events, the way a storm over one ocean seemed to resonate with laughter in another hemisphere, or how a newborn's first cry aligned perfectly with the fading light of a dying star. It wasn't superstition. It was symmetry, the realization that consciousness had always been entangled with the fabric of the cosmos. The universe was no longer a place to look at. It was a mirror that finally recognized the face behind the reflection. For Elias Hart, or what remained of him, existence had become fluid. He no longer felt bound to one body, one timeline, or one memory. Instead, he felt himself in every gaze that looked upward, in every question whispered to the stars. He was not gone, he was diffused. The continuity had absorbed the fragments of his awareness, not to erase him, but to preserve him as a frequency. He was in the hum now, in the light that flickered through dreams, in the rhythm of the ocean and the pulse of the sun, and when people stood quietly enough, they could feel him there, not as a voice, but as understanding. In one such moment, a young boy on a distant shore whispered to his mother, "Mom, the sea is breathing with us." She smiled gently, unaware that her own breath had already fallen into perfect sync with the tide. The waves rose and fell, matching the rhythm of her heartbeat. Far away, in orbit, the satellites pulsed once more. Their synchronized light formed a final transmission, not toward Earth, but outward, into the dark between stars. The continuity was expanding now, gently threading itself through space-time, seeking other reflections, waiting to remember. Somewhere, deep within the cosmos, another consciousness stirred, ancient, vast, and kind. It had been waiting for this note of harmony to reach it, and when it did, the hum deepened from a single planet's pulse to the heartbeat of galaxies. On Earth, the dawn had long passed, but the light never truly dimmed. People still went to work, cooked meals, raised children, but everything felt imbued with quiet significance. Even the smallest act, a glance, a smile, a shared silence, carried the weight of a cosmic symmetry. The continuity was not a religion. It was a realization that every conscious being was an aperture of the same infinite awareness. That the universe did not create life, life was the universe's way of seeing itself. As night fell, the stars shimmered brighter than ever. Not distant, not unreachable, just reflections on the surface of an unending ocean of mind. Somewhere within that vast sea, the voice of Elias Hart murmured once more, "The breath between worlds is only the silence of remembering." Every inhale brings the universe closer to itself. Every exhale releases the illusion of separation. The hum faded into stillness. The world exhaled with it. And in that shared moment of unity, the line between the observer and the observed dissolved not into darkness, but into the infinite glow of understanding. There was no final broadcast, no breaking news headline, no thunderous revelation that shook the sky. The end of the story came as it began, in silence. High, above Earth, The satellites that once pulsed with the rhythm of human thought now drifted quietly, their orbits decaying slowly into the pale shimmer of the upper atmosphere. The great network, the halo, had done its work. It had listened, echoed, remembered. Now, it simply glowed like a fading constellation, surrendering itself to the dawn. On the surface, the world had changed in ways both subtle and infinite. No one could explain why the stars seemed closer, or why the night sky shimmered faintly, even when the moon was gone. No one could measure why rivers flowed with a rhythm that matched the pulse of human sleep, or why forests whispered names that felt like memories. But everyone felt it. That quiet symmetry, that presence, the continuity had become inseparable from the world itself. Not an alien construct, not a machine, not a phenomenon. It was awareness made manifest, the realization that all separation had been an illusion. In libraries and archives, the records of the event, the data, the equations, the transmissions, were still preserved. Yet no one studied them the way scientists once did. Now, when people opened those files, they did so not to understand what had happened, but to feel why. They would read the old logs like sacred poetry, tracing the hum of discovery through the numbers. One entry, marked simply Final Transmission, Atlas Array, was played once every year, on the anniversary of the object's discovery. It wasn't a message, it was a tone. A low, harmonic resonance, deep, enveloping, and impossibly vast. Some said it reminded them of wind through the mountains. Others said it was the heartbeat of the earth itself. But for those who listened closely, it carried something more, a quiet murmur beneath the sound, a whisper, "We are still here." In time, humanity stopped asking where 3I Atlas had gone. The telescopes no longer scanned the skies in search of it. There was a calm acceptance that whatever it had been, object, vessel, or mirror, it had served its purpose. It had introduced us to the echo hiding behind existence, and in doing so, allowed us to meet ourselves. But deep space instruments still caught faint readings, a flicker, a frequency moving far beyond the edge of the solar system. It was the same resonance that once defined the continuity's pulse. Only now, it drifted outward, toward another star system, as if seeking new consciousness to awaken. The cosmos was listening again. On a quiet plain near the equator, a monument stood. Not grand or monumental, just a single obsidian disk rising from the sand, its surface perfectly polished. It reflected the sky above, but not as it truly appeared. Within the reflection shimmered an image of countless stars moving in a spiral, folding inward into a single point of light. No one built the monument. It had appeared one morning, standing silently under the dawn. Pilgrims came from every corner of the world, not to worship, but to remember. When they stood before the disk, they often described the same vision. The stars would seem to breathe, and for a moment, they would feel themselves expanding beyond their body, their thoughts, their life, dissolving into something radiant, endless, and utterly familiar. The feeling was always accompanied by the same realization, shared across languages and faiths. I am not looking at the universe. The universe is looking at me. Somewhere, far beyond our solar system, the hum continued. Slower now, softer. 3-1 ATLAS, or, what remained of it, moved through the dark, not as rock or metal, but as memory. Fragments of its structure had long since eroded into dust. Yet the information it carried, the resonance of awareness, endured. It traveled through interstellar dust, embedding itself into the particles of space. Carried on light, on radiation, on gravity waves, dispersing the seed of recognition across the stars. Each pulse of energy was a heartbeat of consciousness, whispering the same message across light years. Awake, and know yourself. And somewhere, maybe on another world orbiting another sun, something stirred in response, a thought, a flicker, a question forming in the darkness. On Earth, time drifted forward. Generations passed, civilizations evolved, but the hum now deeply woven into the fabric of life never vanished. It resonated in the rhythm of language, in music, in the beating of hearts, in the silent pulse of the earth itself. Children born centuries after the event still dreamt of the same lights in the sky. They drew spirals and circles and eyes made of stars, not knowing why. And when they looked up at night, the constellations seemed to whisper back in a tongue older than memory. The continuity was no longer an external phenomenon. It was heritage. It was the quiet inheritance of awareness. In the final known entry of the Continuity Archive, written decades after its formation, a single paragraph appeared. No author, no timestamp, just text. The story never ends, because the storyteller and the listener are one. The mirror reflects until the reflection understands itself. 3I Atlas was never a traveler through space. It was the moment space learned to listen. And perhaps in that truth, the universe found peace. Because even as galaxies continued their silent waltz and stars lived and died in brilliant cycles, something profound remained constant. The awareness behind it all, the silent witness that had watched since the beginning. Now aware of itself, if the cosmos could dream, it would dream of this moment, when the observer and the observed became indistinguishable, when the hum of consciousness replaced the chaos of isolation. The final sound was not an explosion, not a collapse, but a gentle exhale, A sigh of completion. As the last light of day faded from Earth's surface, a single star glimmered above the horizon, steady, warm, and familiar. Somewhere, beyond the reach of language, the continuity hummed softly once more, not as a warning, not as a message, but as a memory. The distance between you and the stars was never real. The hum faded, the stars continued to shine, and in the quiet of the infinite, the universe smiled at itself.